Good morning. My name is Kristen, and I just want to share with you some things about Good Friday. Good Friday is when we remember Jesus' suffering and his work on the cross. And I want to just bring out two things: his suffering, how much it cost him, and the work that he did, and the consequences that came out of his work on the cross. So on Good Friday, or during this Easter week, we want to look at and read some of the accounts of what happened to Jesus, and those are found in the gospel. But I want to bring out something in the Old Testament in Psalms 22. It's a prophetic psalm that talks about Jesus' suffering. And some of the verses in here, I'm just going to read a couple of them to give you an idea. Verse 6 says, "But I am worm and not a man, a reproach of men and despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me." Verse 14 says, "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it's melted within me." And it talks about verse 18, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Something that we know happened while Jesus was on the cross. The soldiers cast lots for his garments. But I want to bring out verse 1 where it says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" This is how the psalm starts, and this is a phrase that Jesus says on the cross. Jesus not only suffered physically, but he suffered relationally. He was left alone in the garden by all of his disciples. He was deserted. His countrymen, his nation rejected him. The people cried out against him to be crucified. And then on the cross, the most probably the hardest part probably for him was that God had to turn his back on him. God had to forsake him because of sin. And in thinking this kind of relates to his work on the cross. And part of why God had to do that, because God was pouring out his wrath on him. God's anger was towards sin, and now Jesus bore it all. So it helps me to think through pictures of God's wrath. For example, the story of Noah in the Old Testament, where God pours out his wrath and destroys creation with a flood, and only saves this one family that's on the ark. Another example is in Sodom and Gomorrah, where God destroys these two cities with fire and brimstone because of his wrath towards sin. And Jesus, in that same way, took upon God's wrath, God's anger, so that sin could be the penalty of sin could be satisfied. And to me, this is a huge consequence. This is a huge deal, not only looking at Jesus' suffering, but his work and what it accomplished. God now was satisfied. Sin no longer needed to be covered like it was in the Old Testament. It is now conquered. In Hebrews 9, one of my favorite verses speaks of this. In verse 11 and 12, it says, "Jesus entered the heavenly tabernacle, and he did not enter with the blood of goats and calves. He entered with his own blood, attaining redemption." And so Jesus did this once and for all, and it has lasting consequences for us. Now, not only is our sin paid for, but we have confidence in his work. And one of the examples I like to give is my son does gymnastics, and I try to work out with him, and I can try and do some of the exercises he does, but he literally can do things that the majority of the population probably could not do. We have rings in our home, and so I can hold on to the rings and do exercises and pull myself up and do rows and things like that. But I could never, no matter how hard I tried, even if I worked out probably 5-6 hours a day, could never hold my whole body up and sit in an L sit like he can, do a handstand on their rings while they're, holding wings that are moving still. And so I have confidence in him and his work that he could go out there and compete and do that, where I have no confidence in myself that I could accomplish those things. It's kind of that, it's not the greatest explanation or illustration, but Jesus' work is like that. He accomplished what we could not to satisfy God's wrath. And we have confidence now that we can enter the holy place, we can approach the throne of grace, and we can come to our God because of what Jesus did for us. So as we reflect this week on Jesus' suffering and work, I want to just share a couple questions to help you to reflect. One is, how do you reflect and remember Jesus' suffering? Is there a verse? Is there a scripture? Is there a song? Is there something that you do or something that you could do to help you reflect on what Jesus suffered for us? Is there an aspect of his suffering that impacts you? Like for me, it's that relational part of being so alone. And what are the consequences of God's or Jesus's work on the cross? What are the good things that came out of that so that we could know him better? So reflect on those and hopefully share some of those, and we can remember this time.